Well, good afternoon, and thanks so much for tuning in. I had hoped we were all going to be in person this year after seeing so many of you last year. But in the interest of the safety of all of you, as well as myself, we decided that going virtual during this surge was the best thing to do. So I appreciate the fact that you have tuned in, because the topic this year is, I think, going to be very interesting. Looking at the time period between the 1950s and the late 1970s, because it's such an important era. I want to begin by going back to Ed Cashin's book. His book ended in the late 70s, and he wrote the last chapter about this era that we're going to be looking at this year. And this is the way he begins that chapter. Augusta changed more drastically during the years after 1950 than in any period since the post-revolutionary period. And of course, that post-revolutionary period in the late 1700s was when Augusta was the capital of Georgia, and really becoming the mart of the upcountry, as they said. So that's a strong statement, considering all the years in between those two periods. But when we look at it, I think you'll see that he was absolutely right on. And what's going to be interesting is for some future historian to look at really the mid-1990s through the time we're in, and see how it will measure up as far as being a time of transition and change. It's a period where there's change in almost every aspect of life, and I'm going to examine several today. World War II had been a watershed in many ways. Scholars have looked at it on the broad level of the entire country and talked about things like the Americanization of the South and the Southernization of the United States. It's the first time that a lot of people from other parts of the country had mixed together and gotten to know more about each other. Thousands of soldiers from all over America had trained in Augusta on our airfields here, what was called Georgia Aero Tech, and Daniel Field, of course, which had been a city airport, was taken over by the government, and they had trained at Camp Gordon. And so it had brought these people from other parts in who got to know local Augustans, and local Augustans got to know them. And Augustans themselves, of course, left Georgia, some for the first time in their lives, to fight on battlefields whose name had rarely been pronounced by someone with a southern accent. So they came home changed, and the town was changed, and there was a sense that it was time to modernize, to come into the modern world in ways that they had not before. The post-war period would bring the end of rationing. The GI Bill would give many families the opportunity for schooling, as well as for housing, which will be important in Augusta's economy. The women had worked during the war, many performing tasks that had not been considered, quote, women's work, end quote, before. And of course they had volunteered as well. This was new to them, and many wanted to at least hold on to some of the gains they'd made, and in some cases expand them. Many black Augustans had done brave service in the war. We had some Tuskegee Airmen, for example, that were from Augusta. And they hoped that their service and what they had proven about not only their bravery, but about their competence as well, would break the bounds of Jim Crow. So today, I'm going to explore the major trends of this important 30-year span in Augusta's history. And throughout the year, other speakers will be zeroing in and providing more in-depth examinations of some specific topics. So today I'm talking more or less in general terms that I hope will get you started with some context for what others will enlighten us about as we go through the rest of the year. So after the adjustment back to civilian life and a civilian economy and those sorts of things in the late 40s, heading into the 1950s, people here were optimistic, but they were unclear about what direction things were going to go in, not only in their country, but in their own hometown. In fact, at the very end of the 40s, a couple of things seemed to be on the horizon that were somewhat concerning. There was an announcement in the Augusta Chronicle in November of 1949 that had a sobering effect in many ways, because the Pentagon said that Camp Gordon was to be deactivated within a year, and the training school and signal corps would be relocated to New Jersey. Then, a couple of months later, in February, Augusta found out that the Oliver General Hospital, which had been providing services to soldiers, wounded soldiers during the war, would also be closed. And those two closures would hurt the local economy and just the culture and ambience of the local area. But there was also positive news during this time. Clark's Hill Dam project was almost complete, and over 100,000-acre reservoir had been built as a result of that, and that would provide not only recreational opportunities, which many Augustans were excited about, but it would provide cheaper power, which was an economic boon, and of course also a way that they hoped would attract business into the Augusta area. And these announcements point to one of the significant areas of change in this era, the economy. One key to that was transportation, still is. In January of 1946, the government had declared Daniel Field surplus, and so it came back to the city of Augusta. Before the war was even over, there were commercial flights, Delta Airlines, of course a Southern Airlines, flying in and out. And with Daniel Field open, they would soon have both Eastern and Southern Airways coming in and out. It's interesting to think about this, because when we talk about Delta flying in and out, they were flying 14 flights a day. I don't know what it is now, but 14 flights a day was a considerable traffic in the airlines. The problem was that this wasn't totally safe, because Daniel Field was a little short for the kind of planes that they were buying. And so one of the things people looked to was that wonderful airport that had been built for training outside the city, called Georgia Aerotech, and Augusta wanted to get its hands on that as well. The problem was the U.S. government was using it as a kind of like a sales room for their surplus planes from the war. In the spring of 1945, for example, there were 13,000 planes. If you can imagine what that would look like at Bushfield, 13,000 planes there that they were selling off. And a lot of the airlines were going in and buying planes that they could then refurb and turn into commercial passenger planes. Some of the fighter planes and that sort of thing were actually being bought by other countries who were coming in to look that over. So it was May of 1948 before that airfield was turned over to Augusta, opening officially on July 1st of that year, 1948, as the city airport. It was initially named Curry Field for Augustan Inman Curry, but the Georgia war veterans wanted it to be named Bushfield in honor of a trainer who had died in a plane crash there. And Inman Curry said he wanted it named for Bush as well. And so that's how we ended up with Bushfield. And as I said, planes were flying in and out of this new airport once it was open. The other, another important transportation issue was ground transportation. Greyhound bus came to Augusta in 1950, a way for people to get in and out. And I bet there aren't many of us who grew up here who don't remember taking a bus ride somewhere to visit grandparents or cousins or someone. I remember my parents putting me on the bus to Swainsboro when I was probably 8 years old. And also the new age of the auto, along with bus, the new age of the auto made new roads necessary. And one of the things that led to was the building of the Fort Gordon Highway, which became a major thoroughfare in and out of Augusta, not only for just ordinary traffic, but for commercial traffic and shipping goods back and forth. Unfortunately, the Fort Gordon Highway cut into Old Town because it went in the middle of the block between 4th and 5th Street, and it took with it some beautiful Augusta architecture, and of course hurt that neighborhood for a while. In the 1950s, transportation here was augmented. In the 1950s, Eisenhower had begun the Eisenhower Interstate System, which he saw partly for defense, because if you end up in a war, you need to be able to get goods and men and material around quickly, and so this limited access highway system would do that. It came to Augusta in the 1960s, I-20, and it became an important selling point for Augusta for industries that they were trying to get in. And of course, it made possible the idea of trying to get some tourists back. You know, we'd had a huge tourist trade up until World War II. A lot of that had gone to Florida. Eisenhower helped a little bit when he started visiting Augusta to play golf in the 1950s, but we are still working to get back the kind of tourist trade we had in that era of the winter colony. The river also became important, and in the early 50s, a $400,000 set of new docks was built by the state of Georgia down on the river, hoping to make it into kind of an internal port. Augusta would become an internal port. They completed the channel at 9 feet, so ships could come up this way. And there was some traffic. Mary Brick Company used the river in the 1950s, and later Swan Oil Corporation. In fact, Swan was the last real commercial traffic on that river in the 1970s. But with so little traffic by then, it just couldn't compete with rail and trucking. With the interstate now here and the rail system that Augusta had had since the 19th century, the river just wasn't as efficient a way of dealing with that. And so the cost of dredging that river, keeping a 9-foot channel, just was not worth the small amount of traffic we had. And that was really the last attempt to make the river a commercial highway. Further modernization came in the form of communications. Think about what television did. Now, we had radio since the 1920s, so radio begins to connect Augustans with people outside of Augusta. Not only can they, project things, but they can also hear what's going on in other parts of the country, get news in a way that they never had before, listen to radio soap operas, and all those things that are going to bring one part of the country closer to another part of the country. But in July of 1950, an Augustan named J.B. Fuqua applied for permission for a television station. It arrived in November of 1953. And in some ways, television began the homogenization of American culture in some ways. It sort of accelerated this idea of the Americanization of the South, because now people could watch TV and they could see the fashions that people were wearing in other places. They could see these people who became household names, both in the news and in the various shows that were put on. They were watching the same things that an Idaho farmer was watching. And so that was a really important step. And of course, WJBF, WJB Fuqua, was later followed by CBS, and then finally in the 60s by an NBC affiliate, and a little bit later than that in the 70s by a Georgia Public television affiliate that had its towers down in Rennes, Georgia. There was infrastructure that had to be changed. Augusta got a natural pipe, a gas line pipe. There was a new sewage treatment plant built at near Bush Field in 1962. Now, what's significant, that may not sound like a big deal. Why would we talk about that? Prior to that, they were dumping raw sewage into the canal and the Savannah River. So this put a stop to that, and it's going to clean up the city in ways that were really significant and very important. This is a very interesting and precarious era for the Augusta Canal, and part of it was this kind of being a ditch with raw sewage and growth and sometimes trash in it. And in the mid-1960s, there was serious conversation about just getting rid of the Augusta Canal, filling it in. At one time, they even talked about when they were looking at building the John C. Calhoun Expressway, they talked about maybe just using the dry canal bed for that. So it was a very iffy time. The canal's fate probably ended up resting on the man who was the great-grandson of its early founder, Henry Cumming, and this man was Joseph Bryan Cumming. Mr. Cumming got the canal on the National Register of Historic Places in the early 70s, and that ended up changing public perception. Then there were plans about what they could do to make it better, get it cleaned up, build a park. Jimmy Dias Park comes out of one of these plans. So Dayton Sherrouse is going to fill us in next month on the canal and its history during this period. And I'll tell you, I'm working on an update of Ed Cashin's canal history, and it's pretty incredible what has gone on in the last 20 years. But it wouldn't have been possible if the canal had not ended up making it through the 70s with the threats that came to it. In industry, there was a deliberate effort to diversify. A committee out of a group of businessmen from the Chamber of Commerce founded a committee called the Committee of 100. And what they wanted to do was attract industry in that was different. You know, if you think about communities like, say, Detroit or Flint, Michigan, who had one major industry, the auto industry, and if it got in trouble, then the whole economy is in trouble. But if you have a number of different industries, if one thing goes bad, people still need to wash their clothes. So if you've got a company that does that, then you probably are going to save some of those jobs. They could attract people here because we had air, rail, and ground transportation, and we had cheaper industry costs. And all of those were good selling points. By 1956, Augusta could boast General Electric tube plant, Procter & Gamble, Monsanto Chemical, a Rock City Board. 2 years later, in 58, they announced Continental Can Corporation and Wilson Shirt Company. In 1962, Columbia Nitrogen, a Netherlands company, decided to locate here. And in 1964, Olin Matheson, who was also a company that made various kinds of chemicals. There was so much industry coming in that one strip in South Augusta became known as Miracle Mile. And of course, this meant jobs for people, which was very important. There were a couple of local industries that became known nationally and internationally. One was E-Z-GO Corporation, founded right here in Augusta, Georgia. Golf carts that were used all over, not only the country, but eventually the world. And later, out of E-Z-GO, another company emerged called Club Car. So people still know that. I was watching a show about France a few months ago, and they're using a little golf cart, and there you can see on the back, E-Z-GO Golf Cart. It's right out of Augusta. Another local company that did extremely well was Marks Oxygen. Marks was founded by local Augustans, and by 1958 was the largest producer of liquid oxygen in the entire Southeast. So Augusta had new businesses and its own businesses that helped boost this economy, and it's going to make this period a really thriving one economically. Now, two other major contributors. One was Camp Gordon. It was to be deactivated, and it's hard to do a counterfactual and think, what would Augusta be like if we had deactivated, if the U.S. government had deactivated the fort. But the escalation of the Cold War by the late 40s, and then the beginning of the Korean action in 1950, along with America's new policy of containment of communism, meant that a larger and ready military was needed. And so we were going to have a much larger standing force than America had had between wars before. In that period, once the Korean War started, there was an influx of personnel into Camp Gordon. They even increased production up at the Augusta Arsenal, which of course is now the Somerville campus of AU. They fought in Augusta, or cajoled in Augusta, the national government to make the camp a permanent fort. And in 1956, that's exactly what happened. Camp Gordon became Fort Gordon, and it has an amazing history in Augusta from that time on, and of course had been a boon to the Augusta economy during all that time, and is today. Today, of course, is one of the major reasons for growth in Richmond and Columbia County. Former command historian Steve Roush is going to discuss the history of the fort in these years in July of this year, so be sure to listen in for that, or hopefully come for that. And of course, one of the biggest additions to the area's economy was right across the river in South Carolina. In November of 1950, the U.S. government announced a facility that would come to be known here in Augusta as the bomb plant, or as some Augustans says, the bum plant. A boom of economic prosperity resulted initially with thousands of construction workers who came to build the plant. Local officials had to start scrambling to make provisions for schools to deal with infrastructure issues like water and sewer and housing. The federal government actually provided aid to not only Augusta but other local governments around to help accomplish some of this. Now, of course, this was a difficult thing for people who were directly impacted. Not everybody was happy. While the residents of the towns that were going to be obliterated, basically, by this, had been on land that belonged to their families sometimes for generations, and they were going to have to give that up, although they did it in the name of patriotism. They saw it as their patriotic duty to do. Aaconites were concerned about what this influx might do to their winter colony, which they, because of their equine culture, their horse culture, still had. And some over there resented Augusta's unabashed glee over the idea of this big plant that was going to move in there. And of course, for people who grew up here in the 50s and 60s, They remember the Cold War nuclear drills where you duck and cover. You got under your desk and put your hands over your head. Never was, even as a child, clear to me how that was going to protect from nuclear warfare, but that's what people did. In May of 1953, the population in the metro area had increased by 46,000 since the last census. That year, a visiting journalist, Dorothy Kilgallen, wrote an article about Augusta and good housekeeping based on what had happened as a result of the Savannah River plant. Ed Cashin has quoted this in a couple of his books, and it's such a good quote, I'm going to repeat it. She said, "It is as if Scarlett O'Hara had come home from the ball, wiggled out of her satin gown, and put on a spacesuit." And there's some truth into how rapidly it was changing and modernizing Augusta. New housing was going up everywhere, much as it is now, especially out in Columbia County. At East Boundary and Gwinnett Street, a trailer city was set up for the workers. There were 1,000 of those trailers set up by the summer of '52. Now, if you can imagine what that looked like with 1,000 trailers out there. In the south side, what were called Knox homes were being built by the Knox family, still one of our great philanthropic families in Augusta. Myrtle Court was being developed by Sherman and Hem Street, and Golf Court, what became Golf, which had Golf Park Apartments by Blanchard and Calhoun. And even with all this growth for a time, there was still housing shortages. In 1955, 4 neighborhoods were annexed: Forest Hills, Wheeler Heights, Linden Grove, and Kings Woods to the city, creating the 8th Ward, creating an 8th Ward. All of this also led to rapid suburbanization. And of course, as people moved further out to the south and to the west, not too much moving to the east with Fennessy Swamp there, but moving to the south and the west, then we're going to see other changes because other things are going to follow. In April '56, they started building Daniel Village. That would be joined later by Southgate Plaza and National Hills. And although it didn't have the effect that the malls would, this is the chink of retail moving closer to where the consumer is. And it is definitely going to have an impact on the core, the heart of the central business district. Another important part of Augusta's story in this period was the growth of the medical community. When Oliver General Hospital was threatened with closure, the community rallied. One of the real go-getters in Augusta, Lester Moody, working with the district's congressman, managed to arrange for a delegation to come to the hospital, led by Congressman Mendel Rivers of South Carolina. He was the chair of the subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee that was making these decisions about what all was going to be closed. At the hearings on the hospital, Augustans turned out, including many Augusta prominent leaders, to try to convince the congressman and his committee that Oliver General should be saved, that it should be continue to be open. But in spite of those efforts, the Secretary of Defense ordered the closing. But in the end, the efforts paid off because 2 months after that, they found out that Oliver General was going to be transferred away from the Army, so it would no longer be an Army hospital, but it was transferred to the Veterans Administration. And it would be a Veterans Administration hospital all the way until it closed in 1980 when the new downtown VA was built. So for the entire time period we're looking at, the Oliver General was an important part of the community, not only serving veterans, but also a place where local physicians trained, and MCG had people who did internships and residencies that worked at the VA for time periods, and there were a lot of local people employed by the VA during all this time. In June of 1950, the ground was broken for a new Catholic hospital in Somerville. It was to be called St. Joseph, and it was dedicated in 1952. In 1956, the Medical College of Georgia got its own hospital, the big, modern, at that time, Talmadge Hospital. And believe it or not, that structure is still within the structure of the AU hospital complex, just covered over on the outside and just swallowed up, basically, by the bigger complex. In 1959, the Augusta Hospital Authority was created to take over University Hospital from the city government. And in 1970, the University Hospital that serves the community today was opened in December. So they moved out of the 4 buildings that they had been in before into this big multi-story modern hospital in 1970. Prior to that, a new mental health hospital was done by the state of Georgia, and a Georgia War Veterans Home was built, affectionately known even today as the Blue Goose. Both of those were announced in 1956. Another interesting thing, considering what we're going through now, is that in January 1956, children in Augusta got the Salk polio vaccine. They took it to the schools, and people got their shots. In 1970, the Army announced that it would build a hospital, Eisenhower, at Fort Gordon. So in this 20-year period, Augusta literally becomes a major medical center for the state of Georgia, and it set the groundwork for what Augusta still does in medicine. The growth of the population, with people moving in and with the baby boom being born, my family was baby boom. There were 6 of us. There was a major need also for an expansion in education, new schools. In the 1950 to 52 period alone, think about the baby boom begins in 46, so by 52, the first of those are going to first grade, and it's just going to continue over the next more than a decade. In that one little 3-year period, 8 elementary schools alone were built, in addition to some of the middle schools, and then eventually they're going to need new high schools. The high schools included familiar names to us now, Butler and Josie and West Side. Public schools in this era of 1950s and 60s in this area numbered 34. So it was a building boom. Higher education is also changing in this period. The Medical College of Georgia increased its programs. They had a nursing school. They founded a school of dentistry in the 1960s, late 60s. While the other story, of course, is on the Hill, the Board of Education purchased the old Arsenal track when it was decommissioned. And in 1957, the Junior College of Augusta moved out of Richmond Academy and moved up to the Hill, being renamed Augusta College. They were going to come under the Board of Regents shortly after that. And when Carl Sanders became governor of the state of Georgia, Carl Sanders, a local boy who had gone to Montesano Elementary School and then gone to the Academy of Richmond County, when he became governor, Augusta College became a 4-year college, graduating its first class in 67, and soon adding graduate courses as well. So all of these institutions are part of the great expansion and growth of this period. It wasn't until the mid-60s that these institutions desegregated, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. the civil rights movement. But I'll point out that Dr. Joe Hobbs is going to be coming to talk about the desegregation of the Medical College of Georgia. He was not in that first class, which came in 1967, but he was a couple of classes later, so he has firsthand experience of what that was like. And then finally in 1980, right at the end of our period, Augusta Tech, now Augusta Technical College, opened. So an important period for both medicine and for education. In the 1950s and 60s, modernization and being modern was kind of the zeitgeist of the day. This meant new buildings, meant new kinds of architecture. Unfortunately, that resulted in the loss of some of Augusta's significant structures. As I said before, Fort Gordon took out several blocks of structures with its building, a whole swath, including one that I have always regretted we lost, the home of Gertrude Clanton Thomas, a woman of Augusta in the mid-18th century, mid-19th century. I'll get it in a minute. And Gertrude was so interesting. She left a diary, an over 40-year diary. So to have her house still here would have been such a boon to telling our historical story about women. Other losses included the 1820 courthouse, the old Tuttle Newton orphanage that had become the Medical College of Georgia, the old Willenford Hospital, also on the AU Health campus area, up on Walter Way, Magnolia Villa, which was torn down to become apartments. All of that lost to modernization, and in its place, mid-century modern structures being built. As these losses continued to add up, several concerned citizens came together and founded Historic Augusta in 1965. And Eric Montgomery is going to come in April and talk about that founding and those early successes that Historic Augusta had in saving Augusta's architectural and historical heritage. Another important effect of all of this let me go back just for a minute. In the 1950s and 60s, arts and culture also began to blossom. There were three important arts organizations that preceded that date, that 1950 date. The Augusta Art Association was actually pre-World War II. It had been gifted a beautiful architectural gem downtown called Ware's Folly, and was named in honor of the donor's daughter, Gertrude Herbert. And that was the home of the Augusta Art Association, which became the Gertrude Herbert Art Association, and is still over there teaching classes and having wonderful exhibits. The Augusta Players were founded in 1945, and of course they continue to the present, presenting quality theater and junior theater. The Richmond County, now known as the Augusta Richmond County Historical Society, had been founded in 1946 to collect and preserve and publish local history, as they continue to do. The Augusta Choral Society had its first performance in 1950 when Emily Remington conducted The Messiah that December. With Harry Jacobs as the musical director, the Augusta Symphony was founded in 1954. Dr. Sumner Fishbein will tell that story in September this year. And the 1960s brought the Augusta Ballet, the Augusta Civic Ballet, and in 1967, the Augusta Opera Association. We were the only city in the state at that time that had an opera association. So it's interesting how all of this change in the people that were coming here for various things, as well as the citizens themselves, led to just this blossoming of Augusta art. And we might call it the Augusta Renaissance, so to speak. One of the most significant movements of this era is the Civil Rights Movement. Black Augustans had worked on the home front. They had served in the military in World War II. As I said earlier, they were Tuskegee Airmen from Augusta. This push for more civil rights had begun before the war even. There was a push for the city to be more attuned to needs in the major neighborhoods where African American citizens lived. But the war really gave momentum to that. I lost my place here. In 1950, for the first time, Augusta hired black policemen. It's hard to imagine that there were no black policemen, even in black communities, until 1950. But finally that happened. But the same year that that progress was being made, this is interesting in light of debates today, Georgia passed a state law which would require re-registration of all voters, and they were pretty out front. Some of the politicians were pretty out front that this would be a way of getting around black people voting. Because rules had changed. There had been some lawsuits that had changed rules. For example, white primaries were no longer to be white only. Richmond County, interestingly enough, had at least temporarily subverted that by refusing to pay salaries for the registrars to come in and do that. The Georgia Supreme Court had twice dismissed attacks on the law, but it had not ruled on its constitutionality, so it was really unclear whether they were going to be able to suppress blacks from being able to register or not. In November of 1950, the KKK, two men in KKK uniforms, abducted somebody on Broad Street, and that person was not seen again. KK was very active in this time in South Carolina, not quite as much right in this area, but in South Carolina. When in the Sweatt case before the Supreme Court of the United States struck down segregation in cases where things were not actually equal, in other words, they were upholding this idea of separate but equal, but if things weren't equal, then they were not going to be allowed to be separate. Like other states in the South, Georgia started scrambling, and it has this ironic effect of more resources going to black schools for the first time. But the governor, Talmadge, threatened that if that didn't work, if they weren't able to bring the black schools up enough that they would pass court scrutiny, that they would make schools private and give people vouchers before they would desegregate. In other words, they were literally willing to shut down the schools before they would allow them to be desegregated. The Augusta Chronicle ridiculed Talmadge with this idea of turning, public schools and even public colleges over to private boards to maintain segregation. But it's really unclear in the 50s how all of this is going to turn out. And of course, we know that in 54, the Brown versus Board of Education decision said that being equal wasn't going to be enough, that separate was inherently unequal. The act of separating made it unequal. We're going to begin to see more blacks beginning to serve in Augusta positions of elected office or power. First was W.C. Irvin, who was elected to the school board in 1952. We're going to see in the 1960s B.L. Dent go to the city council. Papa Dent, as they called him, L. Dent, go to the state of Georgia, the State House of Georgia. And so we're going to begin to see these cracks in segregation. In the 50s, the Georgia Board of Education banned a textbook because it taught that white people were unfair, I'm quoting, unfair to blacks in elections, school facilities, and recreation. And the book, they said, tried to condition white children to the idea that color doesn't matter. But of course, things were going to move forward because of the Supreme Court decision, in spite of those kinds of efforts. And what the people who wanted to keep segregation called efforts of communists to keep things from staying segregated. Desegregation in Augusta began in the Union Railroad Station. And that's because the Union Railroad Station came under the regulation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the Interstate Commerce Commission ordered all of the things that it regulated to desegregate. It was done quietly. They simply took down the black and white signs and people began to sit where they wanted to sit. In 1958, the first black ball players joined the Augusta Tigers, which was the minor league baseball team here. And in 1960, 5 Payne students rode on city buses, sitting where they wanted to, and sued after they were arrested. Silas Norman, the brother of Jesse Norman, was the chair of the organizing committee. Then we see cracks coming in the 60s. In 63, Reverend Alan Clarkson of Good Shepherd Church led 10 Episcopal clergymen here in asking for desegregation of the schools, and the Catholic schools were desegregated first by order of the Catholic bishop of the area. And so Aquinas was actually the first high school in Augusta to desegregate. With all of this going on, finally, in July of 63, the Augusta Chronicle wrote an editorial that said, quote, "The time has come." That year, voting places desegregated, and black parents, discouraged by the foot dragging, basically, of the Richmond County Board of Education in desegregating the public schools, hired an attorney named Jack Ruffin. You now see his name on our Judicial Center, along with his partner Watkins, John Watkins. And the board started making some efforts that they hoped might work. They were going to desegregate 3 grades in the September of 64. But that case is going to get pushed on because it went so slow. They integrated the 12th grade in 65, 66. And by 1970, a federal judge, tired of the foot dragging, basically said, we're going to start busing students to achieve desegregation. Meanwhile, Ed McIntyre had been elected to the county commission and Carrie Mays to the city council. Back in the 60s, I don't think I mentioned that C.S. Hamilton, who trained a lot of the protesters in Augusta who rode the bus, sat in at local lunch counters. He trained them in the nonviolent methods of Martin Luther King Jr. And in 1973, Justine Washington went to the Board of Education in what would end up being a long, long career working with the Board of Education. Some of the pent-up frustrations of the black community came out in 1970, when in May of that year, what became known as the Augusta Riot occurred. The causes and effects of that particular event will be examined by Dr. John Hayes of the AU History Department on the actual 52nd anniversary, May the 11th, that riot began. He has done extensive research on that for what was to be a commemoration 2 years ago on May the 11th, that of course didn't happen as a result of the pandemic. But we do now have a marker in the municipal building, not parking lot, but up by the building, that tells the story of that event. And John's going to talk about that in May. Well, as neighborhoods began to desegregate, ironically, that sent many young African Americans, especially professionals, upper and middle class people, to the suburbs, like everybody else. Those who stayed behind in places like Laney Walker neighborhood, Bethlehem community, were often people who were elderly. They lived in the neighborhood their whole lives. They didn't want to go live somewhere else. Or people who were too poor to move and could not leave. The era of the golden blocks began to come to an end. Laney Museum Vice President Leon Mabin is going to tell the story of Laney Walker both in its heyday as the golden blocks, its role, its important role in the civil rights movement, and then what happened in the 1970s and beyond as the neighborhood began to deal with greater issues of urban blight and poverty. Throughout the 1970s, desegregation proceeded in public places, especially going into restaurants and hotels and concerts and theaters and other venues. It was no longer unusual to see people of various ethnic backgrounds there together. And, of course, there were many more elected officials in local and state office, and service and civic organizations began to make efforts to diversify. We're also going to see it in education, as I said, and Dr. Joe Hobbs will talk about MCG's desegregation. So, to sort of wrap this up, as Augusta gets into the 1970s, some of the downsides of all of this expansion and growth were beginning to become clear. The city population began to actually decline because the suburbs were growing so fast. So people were moving out of the city and to the suburbs. One of the things that took people out of the city, white flight as it was sometimes called, was the desegregation of city schools. And if they moved into areas where there were fewer African Americans, then their schools would be more predominantly white. There were also segregation academies that were set up and other things to try to get around some of that. But John, I think, will address some of that in his talk. The suburbs are going to have to deal with their own issues because they didn't always have the services that urban governments provided, like garbage pickup or fire protection or sewer systems. People would have to have septic tanks in their yards. We see the county commission, which was really set up to deal with a more rural area, a less settled area, beginning to have to address things that were the provenance most of the time of a city government and urban government. So there are going to have to be some changes there as well. And of course, as I said earlier, with the shift in population, retail left, especially with what will happen in late 70. Even religion left. You think about Sacred Heart Church, one of the most beautiful architectural gems of this entire area. Sacred Heart got closed in 1970 because there weren't enough Catholics living here. People had moved up to the hill and to South Augusta. And so you're going to get other Catholic churches being built closer to where people were living. And the downtown parish was going to be combined. 3 parishes were going to be combined into one. And the church that was saved was the oldest one. And so in some ways the most historically significant, and that was Holy Trinity over on Telfair Street. And then the problem was, what happens to this beautiful architectural gem? And in the 1970s, there was a real danger that it was going to be demolished. I mean, there were people who There was one group that wanted to put a gasoline station there, and I think there was, at one time, there was some talk of a parking lot being there. All of this, religions moving out to the suburbs as well, and other downtown churches are going to see that impact. If you look at that beautiful Beaux-Arts Classical Baptist Church on Green Street, it's now the First Baptist Church out at the end of Walton Way. And so we're going to see those kind of effects. Even things like the YW and YMCAs are going to start setting up these branch things out in the suburbs. So growth brought shifts that had to be dealt with. The environmental cost of growth was also increasing. In 1970, Augusta had the 57th dirtiest air of all American cities. Now, if you think about some of the big industrial cities of the North, for us to rank that high said something. The Savannah River had to be closed because of excess mercury. And of course, the water from the Savannah comes into the canal, so the canal also had concerns about pollution in it. Drugs are going to become an increasing issue as problems of poverty and urban blight and that sort of thing grew. In 1978, a development struck a debilitating blow to the city center when 2 malls opened that summer within 1 week of each other. Regency on the south side, Augusta Mall on the west side. Downtown already feeling the impact of the shopping centers in the suburbs was even further weakened. The big stores downtown, the big what we call department stores downtown, had gone to, quote, anchor the malls. And so if you look at Augusta Mall, they had what's now Macy's went to Augusta Mall, Belk's went to Regency Mall, and there were other anchors that moved out to these malls. And so all of that is going to impact the downtown, of course. The downtown story, beginning in the 1970s, even in the late 60s, before the malls, but in the 1970s and then continuing on, was a story of trying to revitalize the heart, the center of the community. Margaret Woodard will be here from the Downtown Development Authority next October to talk about those efforts at revitalization. And fortunately, downtown struggled, but it survived, and we are seeing the effects of a lot of these efforts today. Now, righting this boat was not an overnight process. It began to, in fact, I think I'll close by saying the 70s, to me, the more I looked at it getting ready to talk about this, is a period of transition where they're trying to figure out how to deal with the rapid change that had been going on since the end of World War II. So in many ways, the 1970s is preparing a foundation for the real progress that will take place beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, and then even into the new century. I'll give you some examples. Magnet schools, beginning to deal with the problem of people deserting some of the inner city schools. And magnet schools were segregated schools that people wanted to get into. Restoration of historic properties in downtown. The facade grant program, for example, started in the 70s, which would mean new fronts to downtown stores that kind of restored it to the architectural grandeur that it once had. And of course, Sacred Heart got saved, which was a major accomplishment. The Imperial Theater in the 80s, the Enterprise Mill, Clay Boardman, all of that, the foundation for all of that gets set up in the 1970s. And it begins to draw people back into the city. They moved the railroad tracks finally after years of working on it. 80s and 90s, we're going to see ways for railroad tracks to go over the traffic and that sort of thing, and that's going to be important for increasing mobility. The growth of the institutions of higher education is really going to take off. Augusta Tomorrow got founded as a public-private partnership and did a lot of the planning, the master plans that made Augusta what it looks like today. Riverwalk gets built in the 1980s. There were art galleries on Broad Street, the Morrison Museum, the Lucy Craft-Bellini Museum, restored theaters like the Imperial, the Augusta Canal being saved and enhanced. All of these things are part of our growth in the late 20th century that was preceded by first the expansion and then the transition in the 1970s. So these 3 decades that we've looked at today are some of the most important in our history, and I hope this gives you some background and some context for it. And I also hope very much that you will either attend or tune in, depending on what this virus decides to do, to all the future presentations. Each of our presenters has firsthand knowledge of what they're talking about, and I think that they will be fascinating. So I thank you again for listening in. I'm sorry I can't see your faces, your wonderful faces, but maybe next year. So thank you.